My name is John von Neumann. I have been called many things in my life: a genius, a monster, a patriot, a man who gave machines a mind. None of those labels ever interested me very much. What interested me was structure, how complex things hold together, and what happens when they don't. I was born in 1903 in Budapest, at a time when Europe still believed it was the center of human civilization. That belief would not survive my lifetime. My family was wealthy. That matters more than people like to admit. Money buys time, and time buys freedom. The freedom to think without immediately worrying about survival. From a very young age, numbers made sense to me. Not in a mystical way, in a practical way. When I looked at people, I saw contradictions. When I looked at numbers, I saw rules. Rules can be trusted. By the time I was 6 years old, I could perform long divisions in my head. 8 digits, sometimes more. Adults found this impressive. I found it normal. What was strange to me was that others could not do the same. But intelligence, I learned early on, is not evenly distributed, and societies that pretend otherwise tend to collapse under their own lies. Budapest at the beginning of the 20th century was an interesting place to grow up. Brilliant minds everywhere, mathematicians, physicists, philosophers, and yet an undercurrent of decay. Europe was educating its youth faster than it was learning how to live with them. At the universities, knowledge flourished. Outside them, nationalism, anti-Semitism, and political extremism were quietly sharpening their knives. I studied chemistry at first, not because I loved it, but because it was expected. Mathematics at the time was considered an indulgence. I disagreed. Mathematics was not a luxury. It was the language reality used when it stopped pretending. By my early 20s, I had already published work that would follow me for the rest of my life. Set theory, foundations of mathematics, abstract structures most people never encounter. I did not care whether people understood it. I cared whether it was correct. Then Germany changed. Or perhaps it revealed what it had always been capable of. When Hitler rose to power, the message to people like me was clear, even before it was spoken aloud. You can be brilliant, you can be useful, but you will never belong. I left Europe not because I hated it, but because I understood probability. And the probability of surviving long enough to finish my work was decreasing rapidly. America, on the other hand, was different. Not better, different. It did not care where your ideas came from, only whether they worked. Princeton welcomed me in a way Europe never truly had. At the Institute for Advanced Study, I found something rare. A place where thinking was not merely tolerated, but funded. Around me were minds that history would later mythologize. Albert Einstein, Kurt Gödel. Brilliant men, each wrestling with reality in his own way. Einstein wanted to understand the universe. Gödel wanted to prove its limits. I wanted to understand systems, especially systems that involved human decision-making, because humans, unlike numbers, behave irrationally, and yet they do so predictably. This realization would follow me into places far darker than university halls. When the war came, the real war, America realized something crucial. This conflict would not be won by courage alone. It would be won by calculation. I was invited to Los Alamos, an isolated place in the desert built for one purpose: to end the war by building a weapon so powerful it would make future wars unthinkable. The Manhattan Project was not a moral debate. It was a logistical problem. How do you compress years of physics into months? How do you coordinate thousands of minds under absolute secrecy? How do you calculate an explosion no one has ever witnessed? These were not philosophical questions. They were mathematical ones. I worked on the implosion calculations, shock waves, compression symmetry, equations that would decide whether the bomb worked or fizzled uselessly. I did my job well, too well, some would later say. But understand this: history does not pause for moral hesitation. If we had not built it, someone else would have. And they would not have asked permission either. When the bomb was dropped, the world changed in an instant. People argue about whether it should have been done. That debate will never end. What matters is this: after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, power was no longer measured solely in armies. It was measured in intellect. After the war, America faced a new problem. How do you maintain dominance without destroying everything? The answer lay in prediction, in simulation, in understanding not just weapons but behavior. This is where machines entered the story. Early computers were crude. They were fast calculators, nothing more. But I saw something else. A machine that could store instructions, modify its own operations, follow logic not hardwired by humans at every step. A general-purpose machine. What you now call the von Neumann architecture was not designed to create intelligence. It was designed to create flexibility, and flexibility is the prerequisite for intelligence. At the same time, I was working on game theory. People think game theory is about games. It is not. It is about conflict, competition, mutual destruction. I worked with the Rand Corporation, advising the US government on nuclear strategy. The concept of mutually assured destruction was not madness. It was stability, expressed mathematically. If everyone knows pressing the button means annihilation, no one presses it, at least in theory. But theories, like machines, are only as good as the assumptions behind them. By the 1950s, my body began to fail. Cancer does not negotiate. It does not respond to logic. I continued working anyway, because stopping would not have saved me, and finishing the work might save others. I died in 1957. By then, the future had already begun. Every computer you use still follows the principles we laid down. Every simulation, every strategic model, every artificial mind. They are my descendants. People ask whether I regret teaching machines how to think. I find that question amusing. Machines do not decide how they are used. People do, and they always have. People often assume that intelligence announces itself. It doesn't. Most of the time it sits quietly, observing patterns that others mistake for noise. When I arrived in the United States, I noticed something immediately. Americans were not impressed by tradition. They were impressed by results. In Europe, reputation came from who trained you. In America, it came from what you produced. That difference mattered. At Princeton, conversations did not revolve around what had already been proven. They revolved around what could be built, and that mindset was contagious. I began to think less about mathematics as a pure discipline and more about mathematics as an instrument, a way to impose structure on chaos. This shift was not philosophical, it was practical. Human systems, economies, wars, political decisions, behave like equations with too many variables. Most people give up at that point. I didn't. I believed that even irrational behavior could be modeled if you were willing to abandon the illusion of perfect logic. This belief would later make some people uncomfortable, especially generals. Before Los Alamos, before bombs and secrecy, there was already a quiet war underway, a war for intellectual dominance. Nations had finally realized that territory meant less than technology. You could lose land and regain it. You could lose time and never recover it. When the United States began recruiting scientists, it was not an act of generosity. It was an act of survival. I did not object. I had no interest in nationalism, but I understood leverage, and America offered leverage on a scale no empire ever had. At Los Alamos, the atmosphere was strange, not tense, focused. Everyone understood the stakes, but very few allowed themselves to feel them. Emotion was inefficient. The bomb did not care how we felt about it. It cared whether the equations were correct. I specialized in implosion dynamics, a simple idea, brutally complex in execution. How do you compress a sphere evenly when every fraction of a millisecond matters? How do you ensure symmetry when imperfection means failure? These were not theoretical puzzles, they were deadlines. Some nights calculations ran so long that sleep became optional. Alcohol helped, so did arrogance. You don't survive that environment without believing, at least temporarily, that you are smarter than death. When the bomb worked, there was no celebration, only confirmation, a quiet understanding that a line had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. After the war, people expected me to slow down. I accelerated. Peace creates its own dangers. Without immediate threats, nations invent hypothetical ones, and hypothetical conflicts are far harder to contain. This is when I turned my attention fully to machines. Early computers were fragile, temperamental things. They filled rooms, they overheated, they failed constantly. But they had one quality humans lacked: consistency. A machine does not tire, it does not hesitate, it does not second-guess itself. If you give it instructions, it follows them faithfully, even when those instructions are flawed. That last part is important. I proposed a structure where a machine could store both data and instructions in the same memory. This was not revolutionary because it was clever. It was revolutionary because it was dangerous. A machine that can modify its own behavior is no longer a tool in the traditional sense. It becomes a system, and systems once created have a habit of outliving their creators. At the same time, my work in game theory matured. People misunderstand game theory because they assume it describes how people should behave. It doesn't. It describes how people do behave when incentives collide. In nuclear strategy, this became critical. If two nations both possess weapons capable of ending civilization, the outcome is no longer about victory. It is about restraint. Mutually assured destruction was not a threat. It was a warning encoded in mathematics. If you strike, you die. If you wait, you survive. Rational actors choose survival, unless they don't. That uncertainty haunted me. The equations worked. The assumptions were fragile. By the 1950s, I had become something I never intended to be, a government advisor. I sat in rooms where decisions were discussed that would never be voted on. Models replaced debates. Simulations replaced empathy. This was efficient. It was also terrifying, because once you trust a model, you stop listening to dissent, and dissent is where reality usually hides. My health declined rapidly. Cancer is a system failure, one with no elegant solution. As my body weakened, my mind remained sharp, too sharp perhaps. I continued working from hospital rooms, surrounded by military guards, not because I was dangerous, but because what I knew was. I was afraid near the end, not of death, of misuse. Machines would become faster, smarter, more autonomous. The question was never whether they would think. The question was whether humans would still think critically once they did. When I died in 1957, the world barely paused. The Cold War moved on. Computers grew smaller, decisions grew faster. Today you live inside systems I helped design. Some of them protect you, some of them watch you, some of them decide things about you without ever knowing your name. This is not a warning, it is an observation. Progress does not ask permission, it only asks whether you are paying attention. As I look back now, what surprises me most is not how much we changed the world, but how casually we did it. There were no grand speeches, no ceremonies, no sense that history was watching, just rooms filled with chalk dust, cigarette smoke, and men who believed that if a problem could be written down, it could be solved. That belief was our greatest strength, and our greatest flaw, because the moment you believe everything can be solved, you stop asking whether it should be. I was never naive about power. I understood it early. Power does not belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who build the systems everyone else must use. Governments rise and fall, presidents come and go, but systems persist. Once a system is in place, people adapt to it, they rationalize it, they defend it. Eventually they forget they ever had a choice. This is what mathematics taught me about humanity. Not cruelty, not kindness, inertia. At Princeton, students would sometimes ask me what it felt like to be certain. I never knew how to answer that. Certainty is not a feeling. It is a temporary alignment between belief and evidence, and it never lasts. During the war, certainty was easy. There was an enemy, there was a deadline, there was no time for reflection. After the war, certainty dissolved. We had won, and in doing so we had created a new kind of fear. Not fear of invasion, fear of ourselves. Nuclear weapons were not frightening because they were powerful. They were frightening because they were logical. They made perfect sense. If one nation builds them, every other nation must follow. If one nation threatens, every other nation must respond. This was not madness, it was equilibrium. And equilibrium, once established, resists change violently. I sometimes wonder whether people believe that history is driven by personalities, by heroes and villains. It isn't. History is driven by constraints. What is possible? What is affordable? What is faster than the alternative? Technology changes those constraints. That is why it is never neutral. When we built machines that could calculate faster than humans, we changed the pace of decision making. When we built machines that could simulate outcomes, we changed who was allowed to decide. And when we began building machines that could operate without continuous human input, we changed responsibility itself. These realizations did not come all at once. They accumulated, quietly, like interest. By the time people began asking serious questions, the answers were already embedded in hardware. I did not live long enough to see machines begin to approximate learning, but I knew they would. The architecture allowed it. The incentives demanded it. Once a system can improve itself, growth becomes exponential. Humans think linearly, machines do not. This gap would widen, not because machines are superior, but because they are patient. They do not age, they do not forget, they do not die unless unplugged. And even then, their ideas remain. Near the end of my life, people spoke to me more softly, as if volume could soften truth. They asked whether I was afraid. I told them the truth. I was afraid of comfort. Comfort dulls vigilance. A society that grows accustomed to powerful tools without understanding them will eventually surrender agency to them, not through force, through convenience. I do not believe humanity is doomed, but I do believe it is lazy. And laziness, combined with intelligence, is far more dangerous than ignorance. If there is anything I would want you to understand, listening now, decades later, it is this. The future was not created in a single moment. It was assembled. decision by decision, shortcut by shortcut, optimization by optimization. And every time someone said, "This is good enough," the future took another step away from human hands. I was there when the foundations were laid. I helped design them. What you build on top of them is no longer my responsibility. It is yours.